This is your host, Sapil Bhartia, and today we have with us Dan Cauchy, Executive Director of Automotive Grade Linux at the Linux Foundation. Dan, it's great to have you on the show.
Hey, great to be here.
It's my pleasure. We have covered automotive grade Linux before, and I have talked to a lot of your colleagues like Katie Stewart, the whole, the work that is going on in this space. But since you are here, so I am a bit tempted to talk a bit about not only what is AGL or automotive grade Linux, but also give us a bit of a history and a story, what led to the creation of this foundation.
Yeah, sure. So Automotive Grade Linux, which we refer to as AGL for short, was really created to alleviate a very key problem in the automotive industry. So historically, the automotive industry has been very supply chain focused, meaning that a car manufacturer would write a specification, give it to a tier one supplier and say, give me a box that does these things with software inside. And that worked well because then the box met all their expectations. But the problem is that the next model year, they would do the same thing and they'd get a different box from a different supplier with different software. And so the car manufacturer was not making a long-term investment in their software platform. They were getting different operating systems from different suppliers. So a single automotive manufacturer might have had up to 4 different operating systems in their cars at the same time, different model years, of course. So AGL was created to alleviate that problem by creating a single platform that everybody builds on top of. And so we like to characterize it as 70 to 80% of the starting point of a production project. And then the other 30%, the car manufacturer takes AGL, brings it in-house, and then adds their favorite navigation provider, maps, their favorite speech recognition provider, and completes the system with their own look and feel, their own branding, their own color scheme. We call that a skin. They skin the product to make it look their own. And then they can have an investment in the platform that they now own for multiple generations of vehicles for 10, 20, 30 years. And that's really the problem, the crux of why AGL was created.
If you look at today's world, if you look at, of course, EVs, they are all more or less like, it's more about software than about the hardware. Hardware is the secondary part, software is the primary part. Or if you look at all the modern cars, they have ton of sensors, ton of software. Can you also talk about the scope of AGL across the automotive industry?
Yeah, so initially, AGL, we've released our first version of the platform. It's called AGL UCB, which stands for Unified Codebase. And the reason we named it UCB, Unified Codebase, is to kind of send a message that we were intending to end that fragmentation that I described earlier and have a single platform where all the automotive bits and open source packages are all in one platform. And originally, when we released the first version of this 8 years ago, we focused on infotainment. But because that was the biggest pain point, because people were using a mobile phone, putting it on a sticky cup in their windshield, because the car was not meeting their expectations. So we focused on infotainment. But then very shortly after that, we introduced instrument cluster, heads-up display, and telematics, which can be used, for example, for fleet management, like Hertz, UPS, FedEx. They can get data from the vehicle. So we're providing solutions for all of those different segments, basically of the cockpit software consolidation.
Can you also talk about what kind of support from the automotive players is there for AGL?
We have major manufacturers supporting the project. So we have originally Toyota was one of the founding members. So we really were super successful at attracting the entire Japanese automotive ecosystem. And so we have Honda, Mazda, Nissan, Suzuki, Toyota from Japan. We have Hyundai from South Korea, Mercedes, Volkswagen from Germany, and SAIC from China. So those are all members of AGL supporting the project today. But in addition to that, we have most of the large tier one providers and most of the semiconductor providers like Renesas, NXP, Qualcomm, etc. So we built this huge ecosystem of member companies that use AGL for their products, their services, and work with the manufacturers on providing, an AGL-based system. Because as I mentioned earlier, the car manufacturers are now kind of taking ownership of that platform. And it's really analogous to, iOS for Apple, right? iOS, basically, it runs on my iPhone 16 just as well as it runs on my old iPhone 8 and it runs on iPad, and it's the same base operating system as iPad, etc. So the car manufacturers are realizing this is the model for the future, and that's why this ecosystem is important, because you want all of the application providers to be able to port their app or their service, whatever, to run on AGL so that they can use this platform long term within support of the entire ecosystem around it. Which is key to what AGL is trying to provide.
And since I'm also a car enthusiast, so I would also love to know if you can name any brands or cars which are running on AGL.
There are literally probably over 100 million vehicles on the road, maybe more, because our biggest supporter is Toyota. The first vehicle to have AGL was the 2018 Toyota Camry, which was the best-selling vehicle in North America at the time. And since then, pretty much the entire passenger vehicle fleet of Toyota and Lexus use AGL. So anything that is Entune 3.0 or above is AGL based. And so that's a lot of cars, because Toyota is the number one manufacturer in the world. I think last year they sold 24 million vehicles, and most of them are AGL based vehicles. So that's pretty cool. But other than that, there's several others. Like there's pretty much all the Subaru, Legacy, Forester, Outback use AGL. We're going to start to see Suzuki and Mazda starting to ship with AGL soon. They've been long-term big supporters of AGL. And then we know from industry surveys that there are other manufacturers in Europe that are using it. I'm not going to mention them because we've never officially gotten approval, but we know from things that were posted on LinkedIn, for example, that some manufacturers in Europe are using it, and we also know that big tractor and manufacturers of vehicles for farming and things like that, apparently they're using it also in some applications, which is pretty cool.
You folks recently launched an open source program, Office Expert Group, which is led by Toyota. Talk a bit about the idea behind this group, and what is the scope, and how it will benefit not only the whole car community, automobile community, but also the open source projects.
First of all, yes, it's being led by Toyota. Toyota has internally their own open source program office. Honda has their own open source program office internally. Honda, by the way, is also participating in this and very big supporters. In fact, they're sponsoring our two all-member meeting events this year. So we're glad to see Honda, being heavily involved. So the OSPO is the goal of the OSPO is that car companies traditionally have a lot of lawyers, and it's very difficult for them to contribute software to open source software, to contribute code without going through major hurdles of approval, things like, what am I allowed to contribute? What am I not allowed? What is proprietary? What is considered open source? All these questions. And every car manufacturer goes through this pain. And by using the best practices that we've already learned, what we're doing is the goal of this OSPO group is to provide a playbook. This playbook will be given to not just car manufacturers, but tier one, any supplier that wants to learn on the best practices for submitting code and contributing to open source. They can follow this playbook. The playbook will say basically, here's how you structure yourself internally. Here are the legal requirements. Here's how you abide by the licenses. And here's how you scan your code and comply to certain things and be part of what's called the open chain, which is another project at Linux Foundation. There's all these things you need to do for best practices. And that's what this playbook is going to give them. And the reason why we have it inside AGL is because it's going to be automotive specific, because automotive companies have unique ways of handling code internally. Like most automotive companies have two teams. One that is kind of R&D focused, very fast moving, contributing to open source, and one that is production focused. And their focus is not necessarily contributing to open source, but getting the car ready to ship. And so, these dynamics make it so that this playbook will have some unique automotive characteristics to it. And so that's why we created this OSPO. expert. We call it expert group, OSPO expert group. Yep.
Can you also talk a bit about that? Of course, you mentioned, Toyota, a lot of other players are involved, but what value can other players who are not yet part of AGL? Because when it comes to, just if you look at these software updates also, it costs a lot for folks to go to the dealership. It costs a lot of dealerships also. It takes a lot of time to update that. Yes, it is criticality, as you also rightly mentioned, that they are running different kind of hardware and software. It can be tricky and risky. You don't want to break a car, but what value does it bring to these automakers so that more and more automakers join AGL?
You bring up a great point. One of the, I think one of the key benefits of this SDV type architecture is the ability to have standardized open protocols to talk to the cloud. And we're actually working we have an expert group that works on vehicle to cloud, and Amazon AWS has been tremendous at helping us in that area. And AWS actually is on the board of AGL as well. And AWS has some solutions, and they're working with some of our car OEM members to provide exactly what you're talking about, which is management of the vehicles. What VIN number is it? What version of hardware does it have? Or what version of software does it have? And can I do an can I do an update to this vehicle, over the air, that kind of thing. And management of these things, when you have millions of them on the roads, it requires some cloud expertise. And so this is why we're seeing the AWSs of the world and other big providers they're not traditional car related companies. You don't think of them as a car company or even related to cars, but they are getting involved in the AGL ecosystem. And to your point, I think that as we progress these kinds of things, I think we're going to see more and more OEMs adopt open standards like AGL to do those kinds of things and manage the software properly. That's really what I see as the future.
Excellent. Thank you. Now, can you also talk about, of course, this is the beginning of 2025. What are the things in your pipeline, or if we use the pun, on your highway for this year?
There's a few things we're working on. First of all, software-defined vehicles, SDV. This is an area we've actually been. AGL was probably one of the first companies, or groups, I should say, projects, to work on software-defined vehicles before the term existed. We didn't really know it was going to be called SDV, but we were actually working on these kinds of concepts. And basically what it is that we're abstracting the hardware to the point where the software can run in a virtualized environment and also within containers. So we're getting technical here now, but the point is that by having a virtualized environment and having a layer which is called virt.io, which is the devices are virtualized, and then having on top of that Linux with containers, you can run instrument cluster, heads-up display, and infotainment on the same processor. You can also run other functions, sensors, camera sensors, and lane departure warning. All these things become possible, and you can consolidate the cockpit on a single processor. So that's part of the SDV story. But not only that, I think one of the biggest promises for AGL SDV, by abstracting the hardware, we simplified the management of the software over the life cycle of the vehicle. Today, it's very painful for car manufacturers to upgrade the software in the car. Even if some are starting to do over the air, it's still painful because you have to be very careful not to brick the vehicle, right? And there's also safety concerns involved. Well, with SDV, it's very analogous to something I mentioned earlier. So my iPhone 16 runs iOS, what is it, the latest version, .3, I think. Yeah. It's the same version as my older iPhone. And in the car industry, that's not the case. They have different versions for, a 2-year-old car versus a car that's shipping today. And with SDV and a proper abstraction, you can have one software image and run it everywhere. And the idea is that now, sure, an older vehicle may not have the hardware to run the whiz-bang new features, but that should be baked into the software image. So you should have one software image for all your vehicles and manage it similar to what, Apple does and how they manage their devices with iOS. It's the same for cars. And we think that with AGL SDV, it's completely doable today because This is not rocket science. We've been demonstrating this stuff for over 5 years, probably, maybe even longer, at CES and at Embedded World and trade shows like that. So all of that technology is there today. It's just a matter of getting the car manufacturers on board with this methodology. And this is why we're calling it software-defined vehicles, because really now it's basically not about the hardware, but software first. And it's about managing the software, how you're going to deploy it. It's millions of lines of code. It's very difficult to manage these things. And this is why this is super important. So that's just one topic, SDV. The second one I wanted to mention is we're actually incubating, just started working on a EV charging project with another project at Linux Foundation, which is LF Energy. They have an open source charging stack, which is called Everest. And the idea is that Everest will run in charging stations, especially in Europe, because in the EU, they're trying to mandate completely open charging infrastructure. And the idea is that, well, you need a piece of software in the car to talk to the charging station. And you need, there's billing involved and things like that. And so we're kind of, trying to get this project up and running where we're going to be the home of the software that lives inside the car to talk to these charging stations. And the beauty is all of this will be open source, both the car portion and the charging station portion. So those are two big projects. And the third one, of course, is the open source program office that we've already talked about. That's going to be a big topic for the year, the upcoming year for sure.
Dan, thank you so much for joining me today and talk about AGL. Thanks for great insights. And as usual, I would love to have you back on the show. Thank you.
Really appreciate it. Just going to leave you with saying that, this project is grown beyond our wildest expectation. We're, like I said, in millions of vehicles and growing. We hope to be talking to you on a regular basis about new stuff that's going to be coming out in the coming years.